हेलो एंड वेलकम टू श्रीराम आईएएस। आप सबका स्वागत है इस वीडियो डिस्कशन में, जहां वी विल बी डिस्कसिंग अबाउट द मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट किंग इन द मुथरैयर डायनास्टी, एंड दिस वाज पेरुम्बिदुगु मुथरैयर II. He is also known as Suvaran Maran. And why are we discussing him? Because recently our Vice President C.P. Radhakrishnan ji released a postal stamp to honor his contributions and to remember the unsung heroes of India in the pre-medieval times. Now, this part becomes important because we all know that UPSC has always in prelims focused on the southern kingdoms. And with this discussion, we will be going in detail from Sangam era to 9th century AD. Till then, the contributions and the lineage of this king, we will discuss all of it, his contributions and how they rose and in which era did they rose, where did they belong, what was their origin. Everything will be discussed in this video in the next 10 minutes. Before we go in detail, I just want to make sure that you all remember at SRIRAM IAS, we provide you with good mentors, the right mentors who help you to strategize your preparation both empathetically and in compassionate manner. What you need to do is you need to scan this QR code and then get yourself a good mentor. Now, before we go into detail of this discussion, I just want to make sure that you remember the chronology. The chronology of southern kingdoms usually has been discussed and is always discussed since 1st and 3rd century, which usually is known as the Sangam period, in which the three kingdoms of Cholas, Cheras and Pandyas was there. But post Cholas, from 3rd century to 9th century, there emerged one more kingdom, that was the Pallava dynasty. Okay? This Pallava dynasty was there till 9th century AD, and then after this will emerge the imperial Cholas. ठीक है, अगर यहां तक समझ में आ गया है तो बस हमें एक चीज ध्यान में रखनी है दैट ये जब पल्लव डायनास्टी यहां पे थी 3rd से लेके 9th century AD तक, इसी के बीच में there was a time period when in this region, in the current Tamil Nadu region, there emerged one more dynasty, that was Mutharaiyar dynasty, and it emerged in 7th to 9th century AD. That is, from 705 to 745 was the rule of this king which we are discussing today, whose name is Perumbidugu Mutharaiyar. Now, if you remember this, you also need to understand that during his time period, or how did this dynasty came to power, or this dynasty, where did they rule? They ruled in the current, or I would say present day Tamil Nadu. The region was, or the mention of this dynasty is there in the Sendalai inscription. Now, if you are well aware of the history of this dynasty, they had Perumbidugu Mutharaiyar I, and then there was the ruler Parmeshwaram I, then his son Ilango Vadaya Ranjan or Vadiya Rayan, then after him came the Suvaran Maran. Now, if you understand that this was their brief history or the chronology, now you need to remember that this king, Suvaran Maran, he was important. Why? Because he ruled for at least 4 decades. He had great administrative zeal, and he is also known as Shatru Bhayankar, that is the terror to enemies. That is how much efficient his, I would say, rule was, both politically, militarily and also administratively. Now, if you remember this, you also need to understand that they were feudatories or the feudal lords of Pallava dynasty. And after Pallavas or during Pallavas, once the Mutharaiyar dynasty rose to power and Suvaran Maran rose to power, after that they lost their kingdom to Cholas, which led to the emergence of imperial Cholas. अगर ये कहानी याद रह गई, ये lineage याद रह गया, तब याद रखना easy हो जाएगा, क्वेश्चन सॉल्व करना easy हो जाएगा. अंडरस्टूड यहां तक? चलो, now let's understand during Suvaran Maran what kind of contribution did he brought in so that he becomes that much important कि 4 decades 40 साल तक रूल करने के बाद उस टाइम पे he brought in strategic regions under his control like Thanjavur, Tiruchirappalli, Puddukottai and Perumbidugu. These were some of the strategic locations which in Tamil Nadu came under his control. Post that, he also had a great military. He was brave enough and fought along with the Pallava king Nandivarman. नंदीवर्मन के साथ इन्होंने लड़ा बहुत सारे बैटल्स के अंदर. That is where he got the recognition of Pallavas. Also remember that he was a great administrator. He brought stability and prosperity to his rule, and that is why he was able to rule for 40 long years. Understood? समझ में आ गया? चलो एक और चीज याद रखनी है that he contributed a lot to the I would say development of temple architecture, and we all remember that Dravidian temple architecture got to its zenith during Pallava region. This Pallavas reign. During the Pallavas, religious revival of Hinduism happened, and in that Mutharaiyars became renowned temple builders. They were the temple builders, and that is why they were important. And after Pallavas, when the Dravidian architecture will reach its I would say heights or the peak under Cholas, this Dravidian architecture is somehow influenced by Mutharaiyar dynasty's contributions. Understood? Now remember that they initially focused on cave temple, क्योंकि पल्लव डायनास्टी के टाइम पे ही नंदीवर्मन stage 1, नंदीवर्मन stage 2, if you remember the Dravidian architecture which started with just a chisel and then just I would say shikhar like architecture, and then this was built into the Vimana which we find in the Dravidian architecture. The chiseled I would say shikhara turned out into the Vimana architecture. ठीक है, understood? यहाँ तक समझ में आ गया. चलो, one more thing which you need to remember, that this shikhara in Dravidian architecture which we find is developed with the ground, or at the ground it is developed with the ground tala, with stucco shikhara. This stucco shikhara or the ground with tala is specifically attributed to Mutharaiyar dynasty. बस ये एक फैक्ट है जो याद रखना है Dravidian architecture से related. They developed some of the stone temples before Chola dynasty, and then Cholas will take the Dravidian architecture to its heights. Understood? Chalo. One more thing which you need to remember is that they engaged in cave temples. Further, up to opening decades of the 9th century, they later erected some of the complicated stone temples also before the advent of Vijayalaya Chola. ठीक है, Vijayalaya Chola, who was the founder of Imperial Cholas, ठीक है, उससे पहले ही इन्होंने स्टार्ट किया था क्या चीज, कॉम्प्लेक्स स्टोन टेम्पल्स बनाना. अंडरस्टूड? हाँ. Suvaran Maran also patronized religious debates. How? Because he patronized Shaiva school and hosted religious debates in his court. Shaivism को इसने promote किया. He also had Jain monks, and his name was Vimala Chandra from Shravanbelgola, who visited to the debate of Shaivas, Pashupatas and Buddhists and Kapalikas, demonstrating the intellectual vibrancy of his court. Now I just want to make sure that you remember that these Kapalikas are somehow, by some historians, they refer them that they belong to, or they are the ones who were known as Kalbharas. कलबहरा एक और डायनास्टी थी साउथ में ही, अगर आपको याद हो तो आई वुड से कि आप थोड़ा सा देख लेना. Kalbharas was one of the dynasties, and they are somehow I would say related, that Kalbharas were Mutharaiyars by some historians, but critics do nullify the fact, and there is a debate about them. However, इनका इंफॉर्मेशन हमें वही सिंधलाई इंस्क्रिप्शन से मिलता है थोड़ा बहुत. ठीक है, अंडरस्टूड? चलो यहाँ तक अगर समझ में आ गया that there was secular debates between Jains, Buddhists, Pashupatas, which was happening in this region, and there was a Jain monk from Shravanbelgola who visited his court. ठीक है, remember the name? Now they also influenced the Chola Empire and Chola's architecture. It was an architectural bridge between Pallavas and Cholas. What was it? Mutharaiyar dynasty. Understood? Chola's adoption. The Chola dynasty built upon their architectural feudatories. The Mutharaiyars also adopted some of the titles like Vidugu and Marpidugu. Okay? Or they were the titles which their contemporaries Pallavas used to take. Similar titles were taken by these also Mutharaiyars. Understood? And then after Vijayalaya's the Chola Empire, or the founder of Chola, Imperial Cholas, once he rose to power, he defeated the last king, Mutharaiyars, and at the end there was the decline of this dynasty and Cholas rose to power. Understood? Why was he recognized right now, or why was it given a recognition currently? Because it is to recognize the unsung heroes of the medieval India, or I would say of the ancient India, pre-medieval era, and it is his 1350th birth anniversary. That is why in Tamil Nadu this does get to the cultural politics, and due to that cultural politics, DMK or I would say the local party, or I would say the Tamil Nadu government had requested center for such release of a postal stamp. That is why it was released and commemorated. Understood? So this context is less important. However, the person per se is important and the dynasty per se is important for UPSC prelims. Understood? Chalo. With this, you also need to remember that they contributed into infrastructure, agriculture, irrigation, temple endowments and Tamil literature also. Okay? Chalo. With this, we conclude today's discussion. I wish you all the best. Thank you for being here. Jai Hind.